A big welcome. I'm so surprised that anybody came. Seriously, who would title their presentation that? I could have come up with something a bit sexier, don't you think? But I thought I should be honest, because, you know, if it's something that isn't something that interests you, it would be crazy for you to spend your time with me. I said this is what don't get scared off by the title. This is what every teacher needs to know. Honestly, after this marathon conference, I think it's a bit tough that you're going to be involved in something that is sort of this cerebral at this stage of the conference. But I believe with everything I am that this is teacher-changing stuff. And I know that the stuff that changes teachers will change teaching. And that's going to change learning. So it's going to be worth the hard slog. I said this yesterday, and I'll say it again, because I don't think that we're acknowledging our interpreters enough. So, mwah.
Thank you so much to her, who's such a passionate, lovely speaker. We like her so much. Lane, lovely.
For the job that you do and how you've made this conference happen, basically. Yes. Who was here yesterday for deep learning? Okay. So, I was a little bit disappointed in myself because I didn't pace that as well as I needed to. And so when we got to the bit that I was really going to speak about deep knowledge and understanding, we had to give it a miss because I'd done my 55 minutes. Anyway, I did manage to find 15 or 17 of you, and we went off into Tank Bar, and I did a little target teach. I'm going to do another one, all right? So I'm going to do it at, where's my Melbourne friends? At 12:55, right after this, 12:55, and we're going to do it in...
the cafeteria on floor 1.
The cafeteria on floor 1. So it'll be quite informal, but for those of you that have the time and felt a little bit disappointed yesterday, it's just my way of trying to remedy that, basically. The other thing I want to tell you before I get started is that I put together an Edmodo folder, or an Edmodo site. If you don't know what Edmodo is, I'll talk about it at the end. But basically, I'll give you a code at the end of our session. And I've already put some files in that Edmodo site for you. And I'll continue to put more in, even files that reference the other sessions that I think, might be of interest based on this, all right? You'll have my email address. I've put it on a little welcome note. So if you've got questions or you'd like me to send you something or in terms of some resources that you saw, it's difficult because with this sort of people you can't really give handouts, okay? But I've got lots of stuff that I'm willing to share. So you'll have my email, and if you want to use it, I promise I'll respond, all right? And I'll do my best to provide what you need should you want to take the next step, okay? So, welcome to human cognitive architecture and cognitive load theory. So exciting. But this is. Scott audio.
The way her brain.
Okay, I'll try again.
As for every single one of us, learning something new means rearranging the way her brain works. Our brain has an astonishing 100 billion neurons, or brain cells, all connected together. Learning is about creating and strengthening pathways through these neurons for impulses of electricity. But between each and every connection in our brains, there's a tiny gap called a synapse. For any of us to learn something new, the electrical signal has to jump across this gap to continue its journey. Between the two brain cells is tiny, but that doesn't mean it's straightforward for a signal to get from one side to the other. For us, it's like crossing a deep ravine. Getting from one side to the other should tell us something about the way we learn. The first time a signal crosses from one brain cell to the other demands the most effort, and it's the same when we cross our ravine. The first trip across it is the hardest. Having crossed the ravine once, the journeys across get easier and easier. And a similar thing happens when we learn something. To start with, learning is difficult. As the signal crosses the gap between the brain cells again and again, we establish a more solid pathway.
Sorry about that.
By the time we've made the crossing over and over again, it becomes effortless. We can do it whenever we like. Finally learned something.
Things that make you go, It's good, isn't it? I think it's sensational to show kids. Because guess what? Learning's actually hard. Surprise! And not only do kids need to recognize that it's hard, so do teachers. It's hard, and I would have kids look at this, and I would have them analyze it. And what is it? What's this? What's it telling you? What are you learning about learning, and what are you learning about how the brain works? And because even littlies watching this, even without the subtext, if the volume was off, and they just knew that getting from that one side to the other side was trying to make a connection in the brain, they would get so much from those images. Yeah? The first thing it told me is, Lane, you don't do enough repetition with children. We do repetition when it comes to things like, English or sort of literacy stuff and numeracy stuff. But how much repetition do we do when it comes to kids learning about ecosystems or forces or, geographical features or things around principles or elements of design? And so I think that's a really simple message about the brain. Are you going to click for me? Deep learning doesn't just happen, it's activated by deep thinking. Well, we started to look at that a bit yesterday. But you know what, my beautiful friends? Deep thinking is actually contingent on how the brain learns. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I want my teachers that I work with, and I want the children that I work with to understand the learning process. I made that blatantly clear in my keynote. And then yesterday, I tried to start to look at that whole thinking side. Because if kids don't engage in skillful thinking and deep thinking, which are different, then they can learn how to learn, and they're going to independently, self-directedly fluff about. But I can't engage kids in deep thinking if I'm oblivious to how the brain learns. if I'm oblivious to how the brain processes information. So what do we need to know to make deep thinking and deep learning happen in our classrooms and in our schools? Well, I think there's a fair bit that we need to know with respect to research, but research that I think is absolutely critical and sooner than later is really around building pedagogic knowledge around how the brain learns. So this is what I will attempt to do today. I will attempt to look at two things with you. I'm going to try and look at the information processing system of the brain, and that will be relatively quick in the sense that I can share that information graphically in a way that I think you can understand at a loose level. And then I'm going to move into something called cognitive load theory, right? Student outcomes depend on the quality of teaching in the school. It's pedagogic capital. I love that. And we talk about investment capital, pedagogic capital. I can't take credit for this. It's a statement by John Munro, who's an educator in Melbourne, Australia. This is what it's about, okay? Practitioner knowledge is represented by the integration of three things. Our pedagogic knowledge is represented by our domain-specific knowledge as teachers. So if you're going to teach children mathematics, how much do you know about maths? What do you know about, fractions and decimals, and what do you know about division, multiplication? Clearly, if your mathematical knowledge is weak, then that's going to impact learning. If we have to teach science, and we have to teach science around forces, what domain-specific knowledge do you have around science and specifically forces? Or matter? Does that make sense? And what I find, and I imagine it would be quite similar here in Spain, is in my schools around the world, secondary school teachers have stronger domain-specific knowledge than primary school teachers. And that's because they specialize, generally in a particular subject or curriculum area. Primary school teachers are often generalists. We've got to know a lot of, we've got to have domain-specific knowledge in a lot of areas. And sometimes that's quite tricky because we're generalists. Pedagogic knowledge. It's an opposite situation in the schools that I work in and in the countries that I work in. Often, the primary school teachers have stronger pedagogic knowledge. Does that make sense? Because that's a lot of primary school in service. It's around pedagogy. Not to say we don't, there's not a focus on any domain-specific knowledge, but, we're focusing on pedagogic practice. That's often less focused on at the secondary level in teacher training, in terms of the countries that I work in. And then, of course, there's pedagogic practice. There would be, especially teachers just coming out of university teachers college, they have the pedagogic knowledge, but they don't yet have the practice because they haven't had a chance to apply that knowledge. So these three areas really make up our practitioner knowledge, or the pedagogic capital that we bring to teaching and learning into our schools. If practitioner knowledge, domain-specific knowledge, pedagogic practice is weak or superficial, then curriculum design, implementation, assessment, and evaluation will be compromised. Make sense? As will then student outcomes. The collective practitioner knowledge in your school indicates its pedagogic capital or its teaching power. If you want to improve student outcomes, then you first must improve the teaching power in your school, and that happens on building the pedagogic capital of one teacher at a time. Today I want to talk about domain-specific knowledge, but not in the traditional domains that we would consider in school. I'm not going to talk about English, math, science, geography, history, or the arts. I'm going to talk about cognitive science as a domain that I think is neglected in terms of our learning in many teacher college experiences and neglected in terms of the professional learning that teachers continue with once they're practicing teachers. What needs to underpin practice? Well, lots of things, but I'm going to focus on two. We're going to look at beginning to develop your knowledge and understanding of the information processing system of the brain, and develop your knowledge and understanding of cognitive load theory and its implications on teaching and learning. Now, let me just put forward at this point a bit of a disclaimer. I am not a cognitive scientist. I am not a neuroscientist. Those are not my areas of expertise, but they are my areas of extreme interest. So you need to take this as a person who is beginning to immerse you in something that you might not have realized you didn't know. And take this further. Anything I share with you, the research is indicated so that you can actually go into that research yourself and dig into this yourself. All right? Beautiful. How do we know kids have learned? Now, I ask this of teachers and I get things like, oh, you just know it. They get that little thing in their eyes. Really? Seriously? That's the best you can say. They say to me, oh, well, they can apply what they learned. Well, how do you know they've learned? If nothing has been changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. And as I get into this, one of the things that was quite profound in terms of its impact on my thinking is that we can keep learning alive in our working memory for months and months and months, as long as it's being revisited and rehearsed and kept alive. That doesn't mean it went into long-term memory. So when do we, and then basically what happens is once it's not being kept alive anymore, eventually it just dissipates. And we know this. How many have experienced that at some point in their educational sort of careers? So when do we generally assess and evaluate our learners? Right after the unit, right after the series of lessons. And so I actually think teachers have a very false sense of security where student learning is concerned. If you really want to know whether your kids learned what you engaged them in, then you really need to do your assessment like 6 months later. Now that would be scary, wouldn't it? Yeah, it would. John Sweller goes on to say that any instructional recommendation that does not or cannot specify what's been changed in long-term memory or doesn't increase the efficiency with which relevant information is stored in or retrieved from long-term memory is likely to be ineffective. I think that what's really critical, and obviously this isn't new research that I'm going to share with you, but it might be new for me and it might be new for you. What's important is that we're doing the best we can to keep abreast of what's out there with respect to the brain and how the brain learns, and that we're constantly taking that learning whenever it happens for us and putting it up against our pedagogic practice to see what shifts we need to make. So I've actually made significant shifts in my practice and in terms of what I'm advocating with my teachers and doing with kids myself as I dug deeper into this research. You're not going to have an organizer, but I did talk about organizers a little bit yesterday, and I'll talk about them again today. I think organizers are critical when kids are doing learning, and generally in a workshop situation or a smaller group, you would have an organizer. Because what the organizer does is it actually sets up for your brain an organizational structure of the learning to come. So even if you have no idea what I'm on about and you really don't know a lot about this topic, you're going to see that we're going to start with a definition of human cognitive architecture. We're going to talk about the sensory memory, the working memory, the long-term memory, and then we're going to talk about learning. Ausubel would have called this an advanced organizer, in a sense. The more you can give kids organizers when they're out investigating or they're out researching or you're doing target teaching or clinics with them, the more you'll set them up to see the schema that actually matters. Does Does that make sense? What I've done for you in your Edmodo folder is I've given you a cheat sheet the organizer filled in, which you'll hear I do with children. So that if you are trying to take notes, generally when you take notes, what are you not doing? And that whole multitasking thing, it's not true. You can parallel task or switch tasks, but you can't multitask. Your brain is focused on the notes, and if you have fluency and you can write quickly, then that's one thing. You can switch back. But I know that some kids only think with a pen in their hand. And I know if they're writing and they don't have fluency in particular, they're missing a lot of stuff. So they always will have a cheat sheet so that they can cross-check their recordings with information that was really important. And then they can use that as a reflection to sign up for clinics. I'm going to give you the opportunity to sign up for a clinic, a virtual clinic. So you'll have your cheat sheets. You can go over those cheat sheets once we leave each other. And if you've got questions, if you've got wonderings, if you want to dig deeper, you can email me, and we can set up a Skype. Does that make sense? In some situations, you'll have questions, and they're not going to be directed toward me, they're directed toward you. So that immersion will lead you into areas of exploration and teacher as inquirer. All right. Human cognitive architecture. Well, human, that's us. Cognitive is thinking, and architecture structure. So human cognitive architecture, it's just the human thinking structure of the brain. And it deals with the relationship between really sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. This is an FYI, but again, you don't need to write this down because it'll be in your cheat sheet. Most modern treatments of human cognitive architecture come from Atkinson and Shiffrin's work. Having said that, recent working memory advancements by Baddeley and Hitch are actually quite significant in terms of what they're contributing to our knowledge around working memory. So I will share that just briefly, but more to sort of send you in a direction if this is of interest to you. Go on, I'm clicking. Sensory memory, sensory register. Okay. We take all learning in through our five senses. You see it, you hear it, you smell it, you taste it, you touch it. It's the only way to take in information. Does that make sense? Okay. All information comes into the sensory register. I'm going to talk about information that comes in through what we see, what we hear, and what we touch, because that's most applicable to children and learning. You have a half a second retention of something you've looked at if you don't focus on it. So I've looked at a million things here, and I can't, if I left and somebody said, well, what were really on the walls of that auditorium? I'd say, oh gosh, I'm not really sure. Because I'm taking things in through my eyes, but I'm not attending. If you don't attend, it's a half a second retention. You got a 3 to 4 second retention for what you hear, and you've got just under a second retention for what you touch. So if I pick this up, and then I put it down, I'll still sort of feel it for about a second, unless you attend. That's pretty important, because nothing goes into working memory for conscious processing until you attend. So, question number 1, I said to myself, Lane, what percentage of the kids that you're working with, or teachers, do you know have absolutely attended to the schema that truly matters? I immerse them, I engage them in learning opportunities, and I reckon I pray. If you attend, then learning will go into the working memory for conscious processing. So this is if you want to you're processing stuff all the time, not unconsciously, non-consciously. If you want to consciously process something and make meaning, you've got to make sure it goes from sensory register into working memory. You can process 3 to 4 things at one time without being cognitively overloaded. That's not a lot, is it? And you have about a 15 to 30 second retention with no rehearsal. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. David Sousa. He's out of America. Let me see if I can show you this. He does this with kids. He said, this is your working memory. Let's put these 4 things up here. You can process 4 things at one time without being overloaded. So if your teacher gives you a 5th thing, you have 2 choices. Take something out, in which case you'll have gaps in your learning, or leave that there, keep rehearsing it so that you can keep it alive, and tell your teacher to talk to the hand. Long-term memory. Long-term memory is where you store schema, conceptual representations of your learning. It's infinite. So, you know when kids say, I'm all full? No, they're not. Not only is it infinite, but once something's stored in long-term memory, it's permanent. It's not necessarily accessible for a whole host of reasons. It can take 2 to 3 years for permanent storage. That says a lot about curriculum design, doesn't it? Curriculum has to be spiraled. In a lot of the countries that I work in, the curriculum is built in year by year, but the classes are built in stages. So they would have year 3s and 4s together, right? So they look at the year 3 curriculum and the year 4 curriculum, and they make these decisions that this year, in the first year of the cycle, we'll do forces, and then in the second year of the cycle, we'll do matter. What's the problem with that? Those kids have gone at least 2 years before they revisit forces. Do you see the problem? So even if we did get these kids to the point where they processed and locked in long-term memory, it could have atrophied or dissipated by the time they get that again. One of the reasons why kids are, I think, learning their English and their math so well is that it's repetition. If they didn't get their addition, we don't move into multiplication. We do the addition, but when it comes to a lot of other curriculum areas, we're much more haphazard and we're much more one-offs. When a learner has taken learning into their sensory register and attended, and that learning moves into working memory, what we need to help kids do is, it's called coding. We need them to activate prior related knowledge in their long-term memory and bring it into their working memory. Does that make sense? So you're taking stuff in through your sensory register, you attend. It goes into your working memory. Then you want kids to go into their long-term memory, analyze and evaluate what's in there, make some decisions that this relates, bring it forward, and work it. When we talk about the fact that we need to help kids activate long-term memory schema, it's a serious thing. Because at a simple level, if you can take this learning in, and then go into your long-term memory and grab things that are related, this one thing isn't one thing, it's a packet of information. So you're still able to process 3 to 4 packets of information. But one packet could be 1,000 things. Another packet could be 15 things. So if you want to help kids to process without cognitive overload, you really need those kids activating prior knowledge and pulling it forward. Does that make sense? And that's not something you do at the beginning of the unit and never again. That's part of your pedagogic strategy. Every time kids are moving into new learning, we've got to help them access prior knowledge and bring it forward. That's got to be a cyclical thing that we're doing. Does that make sense? All right. Now let's talk about learning, because this is where it gets unbelievably exciting and frightening all at the same time. In order for one of our kids to learn, the first thing they need to do is take it into their sensory register, and they need to code, which means activate prior knowledge. They need to bring that into working memory and consciously process it. They need to construct schema that's accurate. They need to organize new stuff with new stuff and new stuff with old stuff. It's called encoding. then they need to tag it personally, relevant, and meaningful. If we're lucky, they'll lock it into long-term memory during REM sleep, dreaming. So I'm going to repeat this because I know it's pretty dense. They've got to take it into the sensory register. They've got to attend. They've got to then bring it into the working memory for conscious processing, and they can't be overloaded. They've got to be in a position where they can construct schema that's accurate, and they've got to reorganize the new stuff with the old stuff and new stuff with new stuff. Then they got to tag it personally relevant and meaningful to them. And then we have to pray they sleep. You know, I do a unit every year at the beginning of the year with children called Developing an Ecology of Learning in Our Classroom. And when we develop ecology of learning, we learn about learning. We learn about thinking. We learn about the brain. We learn about what we need to know and understand to be great learners. Does that make sense? And I do it every year, but what I target for the littlies is different as they move through. Kids need to know this. Little kids need to know that mommy and daddy aren't terrible, horrible, no good, very bad people because they're telling them to go to bed. I want little kids to go home and say, Mom, please put me to bed. I need to lock in long-term memory. Our teenagers need to know this. Our teenagers need to know how important sleep is. Our teenagers need to know that they don't bring their iPhone, they don't bring their iPad into bed. They don't leave the ding on every time they get a message because they need to engage in sleep and they need to get into deep sleep. If we overload their working memory capacity during the learning experience, they will learn nothing, which is why cognitive load theory is so important and what I'll talk about next. Learning. You got to first take it into the sensory register and you've got to attend. You've got to activate related schema in long-term memory, which is coding. You've then got to process that novel information in your working memory. You've got to construct schema, organize, and elaborate, or encode. Get the new stuff connected to the new stuff and all the stuff connected to the old stuff. You got to tag it meaningfully important and relevant. And then we got to hope they store in long-term memory. You can store in long-term memory, but it takes 2 to 3 years in some cases for long-term memory permanency. So we've got to help kids keep their learning alive. We've got to develop strategies and structures to keep things alive. If our instruction overloads their working memory capacity or their cognitive load, they'll learn nothing. Okay, I'm going to give you just a minute or two right now to decompress and to talk to each other, especially my beautiful Spanish friends, so that you can put this in your own language and help to process it a little bit. All right? And maybe, I'm going to show you that in a minute. Let me just see here. Maybe what I'll do is I'll put these graphics back up, because that might help you process a little bit. Oops, come here. So this is what you're seeing, okay? Into your sensory register, attend and code. Activate prior related knowledge. Bring it into your working memory for conscious processing. Construct conceptual representation. And organize, elaborate, which is encoding. Tag it meaningfully important and relevant. Lock it into long-term memory during REM sleep. And keep it alive. All right, you got just about a minute to have a bit of a chat and a rest from my voice. Okay. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Well done. All right, let me just quickly show you this Baddeley and Hitch advancement. So Baddeley and Hitch have advanced this research specifically in the working memory, area of the working memory. And what they're suggesting is that the working memory actually is made up of two separate processing systems. The visuospatial sketchpad is your visual store, and your phonological loop is your auditory store. And that actually has significant impacts on teaching, learning, the design of instruction, and cognitive load theory, because you process separately in those two systems. So the more we can bring both the visual and the auditory into our teaching and learning, the more we expand the learner's cognitive capacity. Does that make sense? So I think it's worth it, if this is interesting to you, to actually dig into the more recent research in terms of the working memory. It's much more complicated than what seemed, you go from sensory to working to long term. This sort of unitary linear system. Basically, there's an episodic buffer that basically, is buffering and combining information from the sensory register, from the long-term memory, shuffling things into the visual processing area and the auditory, and so it is much more sophisticated than certainly the Atkinson and Schifrin model would have indicated, but both are worth digging into. All right, so that's going to take me into cognitive load theory, which sounds worse than it is. We don't have any time to talk, so let's do this. You might want to take a photo of this, because I see people taking photos, because I think these are the questions you need to think about maybe when you leave. How can we increase the likelihood that our learners will attend? How can we increase the likelihood that they'll activate long-term memory schema or code? What can I do explicitly, deliberately, strategically in my instructional design to increase the likelihood that they construct accurate, comprehensive schema? How can I increase the likelihood that our learners will assimilate the new learning with the old? And how can I increase the likelihood that my kids are going to tag their learning meaningful and relevant so they lock it in long-term memory? If you've come to any of my sessions, you'll know that, once I talk about cognitive processing, I'm going to say to you, so you know it? So what? How are you going to use what you know to make a difference in your life and the life of kids? And if you can't start to explore those questions, then you're not using that knowledge to make a difference in your life and the life of kids. This is what the cognitive load research is telling us, and research that actually was attached to some of, God bless you, John Hattie's findings, God bless you, on inquiry learning. So in the research meta-analysis done by John Hattie, we learned that inquiry-based learning returned a 0.31 effect size. 1 year of maturity is reflected by a 0.40. So what that was suggesting is that, inquiry-based learning is actually not making a blind bit of difference. But it is. Perhaps the inquiry that was researched wasn't making a blind bit of difference, but mine wasn't. Just kidding. I dug into that research. I wanted to understand what research was done, what were, how were these findings determined, what were the issues, and that's when I really was immersed for the first time in cognitive load theory. The research around cognitive load theory is telling us that our kids' processing is overloaded, and therefore their learning is inhibited. that kids are not constructing accurate schema. Sometimes they're not constructing the schema because it's not explicit to them. You know, the interesting thing about designing instruction as an educator is when you design a learning opportunity for kids and you think it's beaut wonderful and you know this, you know, stuff's in there, to get them processing as they need to, and the issue is you know the schema is in there because you have the schema. But the kids coming to the learning experience or coming to a text or coming to a website, they don't have the schema. So they're missing a lot, and there are gaps. Sometimes they're not processing well because the schema is actually incomplete. This one's a big one. Lots of times the kids are cognitively overloaded because the prerequisite schema is not in place. And so as a result, as they begin to learn new stuff, they've got nothing to tag it to. So it's just sort of sitting there out in the ether. Here's the big one. Kids aren't tagging their learning personally relevant and important. And so as a result, they're keeping it alive until after the test, the PowerPointless presentation, or the diarrhea diorama, and then they're letting it go and they're moving on to the electricity unit. Okay. So obviously, what's most important initially is this one. Because I can't really worry about anything else. If those kids are cognitively overloaded, there's no way they'll construct schema. Even if they're tagging it personally relevant and meaningful, it won't go into long-term memory. So cognitive load theory is really about reducing the cognitive load so that kids, adults, learners have the working memory capacity to process what matters. Tick, we're moving on to cognitive load, all right? And remember, you'll have all these notes, so this is not something you have to remember, because you'll all leave saying, oh my gosh, I have cognitive overload. Huh? Yeah, I taught you a new word, and now that's all you're going to say for the next 3 weeks. Cognitive load theory is concerned with the cognitive load imposed on working memory processing. And what they're focusing on is how do we reduce the cognitive load so that there are more resources that our learners can devote to the learning task. This is the organizer that preempts what I'm doing, so you can try and construct a schema in your mind right now. We're going to look at a cognitive load definition, just did, and we're going to look at 3 types of cognitive load, all right? So here's some new language for some of us. We're going to look at intrinsic cognitive load, which is all around the cognitive load associated with the complexity of the material we give kids, learners. We're going to talk about extraneous cognitive load, which is all about the way we present the material to our learners. And we're going to look at germane cognitive load, which is all about the relevance of the learning, whether those kids are cognitively investing because they see relevance. So these bracketed words I just did for my own brain to make meaning. Yeah? Intrinsic for me is inherent. It's intrinsic, it's inherent. Complexity is inherent. Complexity is intrinsic in material. You cannot make fractions less complex than they are. It's inherent, it's intrinsic. Is that extraneous? There's so much extra stuff that they've got no processing capacity for what matters in the way you've presented the material or in the way that they've accessed the material. Too much extra stuff. Their processing is going in too many different directions. They're overloaded. Germane means relevance. These two, oh my gosh. Hang on. These two are good. Are bad. Sorry, you don't want kids intrinsically overloaded. You don't want them extraneously overloaded. This one, that's good. You want kids to have germane cognitive load. You want them investing. So these two, bad. This one, oh, we'll try that again. Intrinsic and extraneous, and germane, there you go. And you'll have a cheat sheet. So again, you're a bit tired and you're processing this, and it's a lot of language in the translation for sure for my Spanish friends. But you'll have this cheat sheet, so it's all good. Once we've looked at intrinsic cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load, germane cognitive load, I'm going to say, so you know it? How are you going to use what you know to make a difference in the lives of kids? Now, in a perfect world, we'd have more time, and I would be able to share a number of strategies here. We've got 15 minutes, so that's 10. That's very unlikely, but that's okay, because what I'll do is I'm going to share what I think, but I'll put some resources in that Edmodo. What's more important between you, me, and the doorknob, I don't know if you have that in Spain, I somehow doubt it, is for you to go through this exercise, for you to take your cheat sheets when you leave me, over a nice glass of wine, there's that recurring theme again, or a coffee, or a tea, or a beer, whatever works, and reread your notes, think about them, and see what you can come up with. What you can come up with alone and what you can come up with in concert with your colleagues. I'll share some of the ways that I've done this, but they're just additional. Okay. So, depending on what we do or don't get to, this will be in your folder. So you'll have all these different ideas, but I'll put practical examples of them so that they're not just words. You can actually sort of see what some of them look like. All right? Processing is affected by three things: the complexity of the material, the way we present the material, and whether that kid wants to invest. Intrinsic cognitive load or complexity, that's associated with the inherent intellectual complexity of whatever those kids are learning. If you think about something that's quite complex, all of the elements have to be understood in context together because they all interact. They can't be processed simultaneously. Otherwise, you lose the whole. Does that sort of make sense? And this is going to place a heavy burden on your processing because you've got to be able to process all these bits to truly understand the whole. So if I talk about ecosystems, all right, and I talk about how complex they are, ecosystems are the relationship, are made up of biotic and abiotic factors. So kids need to know they're made up of biotic, living things, and abiotic, non-living things. And it's about their interaction or relationship. If the relationship between the living things and the living things is good, and the relationship between the living and the non-living are good, then we're going to have a healthy ecosystem. But if there are issues between living and living, or issues between living and non-living, you're going to have an unhealthy ecosystem. And what that then means is that you might have some issues with life cycle. So some of the living things might not be able to maintain their survival. That could then impact the food chain. That could impact the food web. That could impact biodiversity. Pretty complex, do you agree? And then I think about primary school, oh, we'll make some activities up for ecosystems. And then we'll move on to the electricity unit. Do you know what I mean? It's complex, it's inherent. We have no control over the complexity of material. This is probably the most difficult area in terms of cognitive load for us to deal with as instructional designers. We try to take control by artificially taking that whole and breaking it up. But what we're often doing is compromising the integrity of the material. And because of that, we're actually compromising the learner's schema construction. It's a bit tricky. So I can say, cool, so you know it? How are you going to use what you know to make a difference in your life, the life of others? Again, I've got lots of possibilities here that I'm going to obviously share with you in your cheat sheet. But what's more important, even before you look at anything that I'm going to suggest, is you really should delve into this yourselves. You You should really go back over that and sort of say, what are the implications for my kids? If we look at extraneous cognitive load, that's about the presentation of the material. And the interesting thing here is that the way that we present the learning to children, our instructional design and delivery, can inhibit or enhance learning in very serious ways. Instructional approaches that require kids to use working memory resources on stuff that doesn't matter will leave those learners with a real challenge to process the stuff that does. When I was a teacher and a student going in teacher's college, I was told to bleed it to death. So they said, oh, when you make this unit, bring in this, and then bring in this, and then they'll be doing ICT, and they'll be doing this, and they'll be doing this, and they'll be doing no learning. But I'll have a lot of curriculum coverage. Things that make you go, When we get kids to write when the writing outcomes don't matter, what they write will take a hit. So I'll give you an example, okay? I'm really interested in knowing whether these kids can analyze information, and in particular, a graph or a chart. And so when they go to analyze that graph or that chart, I invite the kids to write me or record in a paragraph, or I say a story, their analysis. If they don't have fluency in writing, they've got to think up their analysis. Does that make sense? Then remember, 15-second retention with no rehearsal. So they've got to go over it and over it and over it, that first bit. Now, is that a B? Is that a D? Did I remember my finger space? Is there a full stop? What's happened to everything else? And they say, bugger it, I'm not thinking it again. I don't care whether you can write. I want to know whether you can analyze data. Give them an audio recorder. Blah, 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 blah. They can go, blah, 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 stop the audio, think some more. Blah, 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 stop the... Do you see what I'm saying? I think we're using ICT brilliantly for finding out and reporting what we learned. I want to use it to enhance the process of learning. Searching for information. Our kids are going on Google and they're getting hit number 1 of 6,347,000. That's why a kid can spend hours on the internet and we go up and say, what have you found out? And they say, well, nothing yet. Seriously? Or they write every single thing down because they don't have the schema. They don't really know what's important, so they just put it all down, hope not to miss anything. That's a pretty tough call with 347 million hits. Trying to record and listen at the same time. Look, it's okay. I know some kids think with a pen in their hand, so if my kids need to record while I'm target teaching or record while they're in a learning group with other kids, that's fine. We audio tape everything. When I'm involved in target teaching or clinics, when I'm doing anything with all the kids, when they're in their own learning groups with their teams, they audio or video everything. They might not need it, but they'll save it in the event that they or anyone in the group wants to go back over it. Is that not a good use of technology? Too much teacher talk obviously overloads the auditory processing. We have complete control over extraneous cognitive overload because we control the way that we design instruction. Which brings me to, so you know it? How are you going to use what you know to make a difference in your life and the life of kids? How are we going to decrease extraneous cognitive load? And finally, germane, learner investment. This one's actually good. You want this one? Yeah? We want them to be germane cognitive overloaded. Yes. First of all, a learner can only develop germane cognitive load or investment if the extraneous and the intrinsic cognitive load didn't overload them. So, you know, if extraneously they're overloaded or intrinsically they're overloaded, they may want to invest, but they can't. So we got to get those in check first. They might invest the extra cognitive resources in schema construction if they see relevance. We have a whole lot of kids who actually are not cognitively overloaded at all. The complexity is fine for them, and the presentation is fine for them, and they're still not processing well and locking into long-term memory. It's not that they can't, it's that they don't want to, because they don't see the bloody point. Motivation will result in more cognitive processing devoted to a task. So don't underestimate the importance of motivation. There's so much research out there on motivation and its impact on learning. If a kid is truly motivated, if a learner is truly motivated, this might be a little bit too complex for you, especially when we're looking at all of this interpreting. But if you really are into this, you'll push and get through it. So sometimes that motivation will allow you to break through when you otherwise may not have been able to due to cognitive overload. But I actually believe we got a ton of kids who do want to invest, and they can't. Because intrinsically, the complexity was too great for them, or the presentation, extraneous cognitive load was too much for them. We have more control over this than we realize. It's actually one of the big reasons for me why the so what comes at the beginning of the learning. My kids don't do all their learning and then I say, so you know it's so what. For those of you that were at my keynote, they're immersed until they identify a so what. So that they have that relevance and they have that motivation and they're in before the task, which drives the rest of the learning. Funny. Not really. It's not about digital technologies. It's not about modern learning environments. Big push happening now in Australia. It's not about 21st century skills. It's not about inquiry-based learning. It's not even about teaching kids how to think and how to learn. First. All those things matter. But not first. It's actually about the cognitive and neuroscientific domain-specific knowledge that needs to underpin our practice. That needs to underpin the decisions we make around technology, the decisions we make around modern learning environments, the decisions we make around inquiry-based learning and teaching kids how to think and teaching kids how to learn. Do you see what I'm saying? When we develop our knowledge and understanding about how the brain learns and we match this to our pedagogic practice, it's going to change the way we teach. And that, my beautiful friends, will change the way they learn. Cheers. So just quickly, if you want to write that code down, all right, or take a photo, if you're not familiar with Edmodo, Google Edmodo or put in edmodo.com. You have to download, no, you don't download it. You just have to register. It's free. And then basically what will happen when you register is you'll have a place that you can click on, and it's unfortunately not as explicit as it should be. It's a little plus sign. So it's on the left-hand side. It's a little plus sign. When you click on that, it will say code. As soon as you put that in, you're in. I have a welcome little note, and I have all your cheat sheets. I've put in the Think Inc. real learning process. I put a 2-page at a glance on what happens at the stages. I put in a think box, and I put in my 9-step planning process for how I plan differently to get the so what, but also to bring in processes, content, and skills, all right? I will then add some more bits and pieces once I have a bit of time to decompress. All right? So just looking forward to connecting through Edmodo. I'm now going to R2 for anyone that wants to join me to look at developing deep knowledge and deep understanding. Cheers.